Margaret Henderson never expected that emptying a trash can would uncover a conspiracy worth millions of dollars and cost her everything she thought she knew about justice. What started as another mundane Tuesday night cleaning the executive offices at Pinnacle Shooting Club would end with her holding evidence that could topple some of the most powerful men in the state. But the real shock wasn't what she found, it was how far they were willing to go to silence a woman they saw as nothing more than invisible help. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Maggie pushed her cleaning cart down the marble hallway of Pinnacle Shooting Club, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floors. At 52, she had been cleaning these halls for nearly 8 years. Moving through the shadows of wealth and privilege like a ghost, the members barely acknowledged her presence, which suited her just fine. She preferred the quiet dignity of honest work to the empty flattery she often overheard in the executive boardroom. Pinnacle wasn't just any shooting range. Nestled in the hills outside Richmond, Virginia, it catered to politicians, defense contractors, and old money families who treated marksmanship as both sport and statement. The membership fee alone was more than Maggie made in 6 months. But she had never felt bitter about it. Everyone had their place in the world, her mother used to say, and hers was to work hard, keep her head down, and provide for her teenage daughter, Sarah. Tonight felt different, though. The usual Tuesday evening crowd had dispersed earlier than normal, leaving an unsettling quiet that made every footstep echo. Maggie had noticed several black SUVs in the parking lot when she arrived. Vehicles that didn't belong to the regular members she recognized. Their presence had left her with an odd feeling of unease that she couldn't quite shake. As she approached the executive conference room, she could hear muffled voices through the heavy oak door. This wasn't unusual club business. Often ran late into the evening, but something about the tone caught her attention. There was an urgency, an anger that cut through the typical measured discussions of golf handicaps and stock portfolios. Maggie had learned long ago that the best cleaning staff were the ones who heard nothing and saw nothing. It was a survival skill in her line of work. But as she set up to clean the adjacent office, fragments of conversation drifted through the walls, and what she heard made her blood run cold. The shipment from Montenegro arrives Thursday. A gruff voice was saying, "Senator Williams has the customs paperwork ready, but we need to make sure the harbor master stays quiet." Another voice, smoother and more refined, responded, "Patterson's people have been asking questions about the club's import records. We may need to accelerate the timeline." Maggie froze, her hand gripping the handle of her vacuum cleaner. Montenegro. Import records. This didn't sound like club business at all. She pressed closer to the wall, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would give her away. The beauty of this operation, the refined voice continued, is that no one suspects a thing. Who's going to question a shooting club importing sporting equipment? We've been moving military-grade weapons through here for 2 years, and not a single investigator has looked twice at our books. The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. Military-grade weapons. The Pinnacle Shooting Club, with its reputation for tradition and respectability, was a front for arms smuggling. She thought of all the politicians she'd seen walking these halls, the defense contractors who held private meetings in the conference rooms, the foreign visitors who spoke in hushed tones about cultural exchanges. "What about the cleaning lady?" a third voice asked. "Younger and more nervous than the others. She's been here for years." She could have overheard something. Maggie's blood turned to ice. They were talking about her. The refined voice laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Margaret Henderson, please. She's a 40-something divorcee from the wrong side of town who barely finished high school. Even if she heard something, who would believe her? And more importantly, who would she tell? Her biggest concern is making rent and keeping her daughter in community college. The casual cruelty of the assessment stung more than Maggie expected. They had clearly looked into her background, reducing her life to a few dismissive sentences. But their contempt might also be her protection. They genuinely didn't see her as a threat. Besides, the gruff voice added, women like that know their place. They don't cause trouble because they can't afford to. She needs this job more than she needs to play hero. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, during which Maggie learned more than she ever wanted to know about the operation. The club was importing weapons from Eastern Europe. Using falsified sporting goods documentation, Senator Richard Williams, a prominent figure on the Armed Services Committee, was facilitating the customs clearance in exchange for substantial campaign contributions and personal payments. The weapons were then distributed to various militia groups and private military contractors operating in Africa and South America. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This wasn't just about illegal weapons, it was about American officials profiting from conflicts in developing nations, using a prestigious shooting club as cover for their operations. The amounts of money being discussed made Maggie's head spin. Millions of dollars were changing hands while she scrubbed their toilets for $12 an hour. When the voices finally faded and she heard footsteps heading toward the exit, Maggie remained perfectly still. She waited until she heard car engines starting in the parking lot before allowing herself to breathe normally again. Her hands were shaking as she tried to process what she had learned. The smart thing to do was to forget everything she had heard, to continue cleaning, collect her paycheck, and pretend this night had never happened. These were powerful people with resources she couldn't imagine. They had already demonstrated their contempt for her, but they had also revealed something more dangerous, their certainty that she posed no threat. But as Maggie mechanically went through the motions of cleaning the conference room, she couldn't stop thinking about Sarah. Her daughter was studying journalism at the community college, working part-time at the campus newspaper, and dreaming of becoming an investigative reporter. Sarah had inherited her father's idealism, the same trait that had gotten him killed while serving as a military contractor in Afghanistan. He had tried to report corruption in the reconstruction efforts and had died in what was officially ruled an accident. The irony wasn't lost on Maggie. Here she was, a woman they considered too insignificant to matter, sitting on evidence of the exact kind of corruption that had cost her husband his life. Sarah would tell her to go to the authorities, to fight for justice, regardless of the personal cost. But Sarah was 20 years old and still believed the world was fair. As Maggie emptied the wastebaskets in the conference room, her eyes fell on a discarded manila folder that had missed the shredder. Inside were shipping manifests, customs declarations, and what appeared to be coded communications. The documents were damning, clearly showing the falsification of import records and the movement of restricted weapons. Her hands trembling, Maggie photographed the documents with her phone, a cheap device Sarah had insisted she carry for emergencies. The camera quality was poor, but the text was legible. She also found flash drives in the executive offices, the devices that had been carelessly left behind in the rush to leave. Over the next several days, Maggie continued her routine while secretly gathering evidence. She arrived early and stayed late, using her master keys to access offices and files that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The conspiracy reached deep into state government, with judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials all receiving payments to look the other way. The more she learned, the more isolated she felt. This wasn't something she could take to the local police. Several officers were on the payroll. The FBI field office in Richmond had at least 2 agents who were compromised. Even some journalists at the major newspapers were receiving payments to kill stories that got too close to the truth. Maggie realized she was sitting on the biggest story in decades, but she had no safe way to tell it. Every traditional avenue had been corrupted or compromised. She was a working-class woman with a high school education facing off against a network of some of the most powerful people in the state. The breakthrough came when she overheard a phone conversation in the club manager's office. Gregory Patterson, the refined voice from that first meeting, was speaking to someone about eliminating a persistent problem in the state attorney general's office. A prosecutor named David Chen had been asking questions about unusual financial activity connected to several defense contractors. "We can't keep buying people off," Patterson was saying. "Sometimes you have to send a stronger message. Make it look like an accident. But make sure word gets around that curiosity can be dangerous." Maggie realized they were planning to murder a prosecutor, and she finally understood the full scope of what she was dealing with. These weren't just white-collar criminals. They were killers who had probably been responsible for other accidents over the years, including possibly her husband's death. That night, Maggie made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't go to the authorities because she didn't know who to trust, but she could go to someone who was already a target. If David Chen was asking the right questions, maybe he was someone she could trust with the evidence she had gathered. Finding Chen proved easier than expected. He was prosecuting a high-profile corruption case and had been in the news frequently. Maggie called his office and asked to speak with him about the Patterson case. Using the name she had heard in the club, the secretary was initially dismissive, but when Maggie mentioned Montenegro shipping records, she was transferred immediately. Chen agreed to meet her at a diner on the outskirts of town, a location Maggie chose because it was far from the club and the usual haunts of its members. She had never felt more nervous in her life as she sat in the vinyl booth, clutching a manila envelope containing copies of everything she had found. When Chen arrived, he looked nothing like what she had expected. He was younger than she had imagined, probably in his early 30s, with tired eyes that suggested he had seen too much corruption for his age. He listened quietly as she explained how she had come across the information, never once showing the dismissive attitude she had feared. "Mrs. Henderson," he said when she finished, "do you understand what you're giving me? Evidence of the biggest weapons smuggling operation on the East Coast." She replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "More than that," Chen said, flipping through the documents. "This is evidence of treason. Some of these weapons are ending up with groups that are actively fighting American interests. Senator Williams and his co-conspirators aren't just breaking the law, they're betraying their country for profit." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. She had suspected the operation was big, but she hadn't fully grasped the national security implications. "What happens now?" she asked. Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "Now you go home and pretend this conversation never happened. Don't change your routine at the club. Don't act suspicious. And don't tell anyone what you've done. I'm going to need time to verify this information and build a case. But Mrs. Henderson, you've just handed me the key to taking down one of the most dangerous criminal organizations I've ever encountered." "What about my safety?" Maggie asked. "They've killed people before." "I know," Chen said grimly. "That's why this has to be handled very carefully. But Mrs. Henderson, what you've done here takes extraordinary courage. Most people would have walked away, "My husband died trying to expose corruption like this," she said simply. "I couldn't walk away." Over the next several weeks, Maggie continued working at the club while Chen quietly built his case. The prosecutor was careful not to contact her directly, but she could see changes in the behavior of the club members. Conversations became more guarded. Meetings were moved to off-site locations, and there was a general atmosphere of paranoia that hadn't existed before. Patterson began watching her more closely. Though he tried to be subtle about it, she would catch him observing her as she cleaned, and once she found him going through her cleaning supplies, claiming he was looking for a specific type of disinfectant. The attention made her nervous, but she forced herself to maintain her routine. The situation escalated when Chen's investigation became public knowledge. A grand jury was convened to investigate illegal weapons trafficking, and while no names were initially released, word spread quickly through the networks of power and influence that connected the club's membership. Maggie was cleaning the executive offices when she overheard Patterson on the phone. His voice tight, with barely controlled panic. "Someone's been feeding information to the prosecutor," he was saying. "We need to find out who and deal with them permanently. My sources say Chen has documents that could only have come from inside the club." Her blood ran cold as she realized the net was closing around her. They hadn't connected her to the leak yet, but it was only a matter of time. The end came sooner than she expected. Maggie arrived at work the following Tuesday to find Patterson waiting for her in the hallway, flanked by two men she didn't recognize. Their suits were expensive, but there was something about their posture and the way their eyes moved that suggested violence lurked just beneath the surface. "Margaret," Patterson said with false warmth, "we need to have a conversation." She knew in that moment that her life was in danger. These men weren't here to ask questions, they were here to eliminate a problem. But Maggie had spent 8 years moving invisibly through these halls, and she knew every exit, every hiding place, every security camera blind spot. "Of course, Mr. Patterson," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Let me just put my card away." As she moved toward the supply closet, Maggie palmed the small canister of industrial cleaning solvent she always carried. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was something. More importantly, she knew that the supply closet connected to a maintenance corridor that led to the parking garage. "Actually, Margaret, why don't you come with us now?" one of the men said, stepping closer. That's when Maggie acted. She sprayed the cleaning solvent directly into the eyes of the nearest man, causing him to cry out and stumble backward. In the confusion, she darted into the supply closet and slammed the door behind her. Engaging the industrial lock from the inside, she could hear them pounding on the door as she crawled through the maintenance corridor, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Behind her, she could hear Patterson shouting orders and the sound of the men trying to break down the door. The corridor led to the parking garage, where Maggie's ancient Honda Civic waited in the shadows. She had never been so grateful for her paranoid habit of always parking near the exit. As she fumbled with her keys, she could hear footsteps echoing in the stairwell behind her. The engine turned over on the second try, and Maggie gunned it toward the exit just as the two men burst into the garage. In her rearview mirror, she could see them running toward their own vehicle, and she knew the chase was on. What followed was 20 minutes of the most terrifying driving of Maggie's life. Her old Honda was no match for the powerful sedan that pursued her through the winding roads outside Richmond. But she had one advantage. He knew these roads from years of commuting to work, while her pursuers were clearly unfamiliar with the area. She managed to lose them by turning into a shopping center and hiding her car behind a large delivery truck. As she sat there shaking, Maggie realized that her old life was over. She could never return to the club. And these people would never stop looking for her. Using a payphone at the shopping center, she called Chen's emergency number. Within an hour, she was in federal protective custody. Her testimony, now the cornerstone of what would become the largest weapons trafficking case in Virginia history. The trial lasted 6 months and made national headlines. Senator Williams, Gregory Patterson, and 14 co-conspirators were convicted on charges ranging from weapons trafficking to conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence Maggie had gathered proved crucial in securing convictions, but it was her testimony that captivated the jury and the public. Here was a working-class woman who had risked everything to expose corruption at the highest levels of government. She hadn't done it for money or fame, she had done it because it was right. Her courage in the face of overwhelming odds resonated with people across the country who felt powerless against systemic corruption. The media attention was overwhelming at first, but Maggie handled it with the same quiet dignity she had brought to her work at the club. She testified truthfully about what she had seen and heard, never embellishing or sensationalizing the facts. When defense attorneys tried to dismiss her as an uneducated cleaning lady who couldn't possibly understand the complex matters she was describing, she calmly produced the evidence she had gathered and walked them through each document. "I may not have a college degree," she told the court, "but I know right from wrong. And I know that when people in positions of trust betray that trust for money, someone has to stand up and say it's not acceptable." The convictions led to a broader investigation that uncovered similar operations in other states. Maggie's courage had not only exposed one criminal conspiracy, but had opened the door to cleaning up a network of corruption that had operated with impunity for years. After the trial, Maggie was offered a substantial reward by the federal government for her role in exposing the weapons trafficking ring. She used part of the money to pay for Sarah's education, but most of it went to establishing a scholarship fund for children of working-class families who wanted to pursue careers in journalism and criminal justice. She never returned to cleaning other people's offices. Instead, she became a whistleblower advocate, helping other ordinary citizens who found themselves in possession of extraordinary information about corruption and crime. Her experience had taught her that the most powerful weapon against injustice wasn't wealth or connections, it was the courage to speak the truth. Regardless of the personal cost, the Pinnacle Shooting Club was shut down permanently. Its assets seized by the federal government. The building was eventually converted into a community center, a transformation that Maggie found deeply satisfying. Where once powerful men had plotted to profit from violence and corruption, children now learned to read, and families gathered for community events. Years later, when Sarah graduated from journalism school with honors and began working for a major investigative news organization, she would often ask her mother how she had found the courage to take on such powerful enemies. "I didn't set out to be brave," Maggie would tell her. "I just reached a point where I couldn't live with staying silent." Sometimes the most ordinary people are called to do extraordinary things, not because they're special, but because they're the ones who happen to be there when the moment requires action. The case became a landmark in whistleblower protection, with new laws passed to safeguard people who expose corruption. Maggie testified before Congress about the need to protect ordinary citizens who find themselves in possession of information about crimes committed by powerful people. In her testimony, she emphasized that the most dangerous assumption is that working-class people don't understand or care about complex issues. "We see everything," she told the senators. "We're in your offices. your homes, your private clubs. We hear your conversations and we understand more than you think we do. The only reason we don't speak up more often is that we're afraid no one will listen or believe us. The impact of her words extended far beyond the specific case of the weapons trafficking ring. Her story became a symbol of how ordinary citizens could hold powerful institutions accountable, and it inspired similar cases of whistleblowing across the country. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Maggie saw herself. For 52 years, she had accepted other people's assessment of her worth and her place in the world. She had internalized the message that her job was to be invisible, to clean up other people's messes without asking questions or expecting recognition. The experience at Pinnacle had shattered those assumptions. She learned that her observations mattered, that her moral compass was as valid as anyone else's, and that her willingness to act on her principles could change the world in ways she had never imagined. I used to think my job was to be invisible, she reflected in one interview, but sometimes being invisible gives you the perfect vantage point to see things that others miss. The key is knowing when to step out of the shadows and into the light. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was generational. Sarah's career in investigative journalism was directly inspired by her mother's courage, and she went on to expose several major scandals of her own. But more importantly, she carried forward the lesson that the most important qualification for fighting injustice isn't education or connections. It's the willingness to act when action is required. Margaret Henderson had walked into Pinnacle Shooting Club as a woman the members saw as beneath their notice. She left as someone who had fundamentally altered the landscape of power and accountability in American politics. Her story proved that in a democracy, the most dangerous person to a corrupt system isn't necessarily the most powerful or the most educated. It's the one with nothing to lose and everything to gain by telling the truth. The janitor who was supposed to clean up their messes had instead cleaned house in a way that sent shockwaves through the corridors of power, and in doing so, she had redefined what it meant to be a simple woman in a complex world, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary courage comes from the most ordinary places. Word count 4. 12 words. I need to continue to reach exactly 8,000 words as requested. Let me expand the story further. The reverberations of the Pinnacle case continued long after the courtroom drama ended. Maggie found herself thrust into a world she had never imagined testifying before. Congressional committees, speaking at universities, and consulting with law enforcement agencies on how to better protect and encourage whistleblowers. It was a far cry from her quiet life, emptying trash cans and mopping floors. The transition wasn't always easy. There were nights when she missed the simple routine of her cleaning job, the predictable rhythm of moving through empty buildings while the rest of the world slept. Now her days were filled with phone calls from reporters, meetings with attorneys, and speaking engagements at events where she felt perpetually out of place among academics and policy experts. But gradually, Maggie began to understand that her background wasn't a liability. It was her greatest asset. When she spoke to audiences about corruption and accountability, her words carried a weight that no academic treatise could match. She had lived the reality of being dismissed and underestimated, and her authenticity resonated with people who felt similarly invisible in their own lives. The speaking circuit introduced her to other whistleblowers who had risked everything to expose wrongdoing. She met a nurse who had revealed safety violations at a Veterans Administration hospital, a factory worker who had exposed environmental contamination, and a secretary who had uncovered embezzlement at a major charity. What struck Maggie was how many of them were women. people of color, or working-class individuals, people whose voices were often dismissed, but who saw things that others missed. This observation led to her next major project. Working with a coalition of advocacy groups, Maggie helped establish the Ordinary Heroes Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting and protecting whistleblowers from non-traditional backgrounds. The foundation provided legal support, financial assistance, and emotional counseling for people who found themselves in situations similar to what she had experienced. The foundation's first major case involved Maria Santos, a housekeeper at a luxury resort who had discovered that the facility was being used to launder money for drug cartels. Like Maggie, Maria had been dismissed as just the help by the criminals, who never imagined she understood enough English to comprehend their conversations or had the courage to act on what she learned. With the foundation's support, Maria's evidence led to the arrest of 12 individuals and the seizure of over $50 million in drug money. More importantly, it established a pattern that would be repeated dozens of times over the following years. Working-class individuals in service jobs uncovering major crimes because their invisibility gave them access to information that others couldn't obtain. The success of these cases began to change how law enforcement approached investigations of white-collar crime. FBI agents started cultivating relationships with cleaning staff, maintenance workers, and other service employees at major corporations and government facilities. What had once been seen as the most unlikely source of intelligence became recognized as potentially the most valuable. This shift didn't go unnoticed by the criminals themselves. Corporate security firms began conducting background checks on all service employees, and some companies moved to automated cleaning systems to reduce human access to sensitive areas. The arms race between criminals seeking privacy and investigators seeking intelligence had entered a new phase, with ordinary workers caught in the middle. For Maggie, this development was both gratifying and concerning. She was proud that her case had opened new avenues for accountability, but she worried about the increased scrutiny facing people in jobs like her old one. The foundation began offering security training and legal workshops for service workers, teaching them how to protect themselves while still being able to report crimes they witnessed. The most satisfying aspect of her new role was mentoring other women who found themselves in similar situations. Maggie received dozens of calls each month from people who had stumbled across evidence of wrongdoing and didn't know what to do with it. Many were scared, unsure whether they had really seen what they thought they had seen, and convinced that no one would believe them. Her advice was always the same: trust your instincts, document everything safely, and remember that your perspective matters. She had learned that criminals often became careless around people they considered insignificant, and that carelessness was often their downfall. One particularly memorable case involved Linda Peterson, a 58-year-old office cleaner who had discovered that a prominent fertility clinic was performing illegal genetic modifications on embryos. The doctors involved had discussed their work openly in front of Linda, assuming she wouldn't understand the medical terminology or realize the significance of what she was hearing. But Linda had spent 2 decades cleaning medical facilities, and she had picked up more knowledge about healthcare than most people realized. When she heard the doctors discussing procedures that she knew were banned by federal law, she began paying closer attention to their conversations and quietly photographing documents left on desks. The evidence Linda gathered led to a federal investigation that shut down the clinic and resulted in criminal charges against 5 physicians. The case made international headlines and sparked a broader conversation about the regulation of genetic research. Throughout the legal proceedings, Linda credited Maggie's example with giving her the courage to come forward. I kept thinking about Mrs. Henderson and how she could have just walked away from what she heard, Linda told reporters. But she didn't. And because of that, a lot of bad people went to prison. I figured if she could do it, so could I. These success stories helped establish Maggie's reputation as an expert on workplace-based whistleblowing, but they also attracted attention from people who wished she would disappear. Former associates of the Pinnacle conspirators who had avoided prosecution began spreading rumors about her, questioning her motives and suggesting she was profiting from her notoriety. The attacks became more personal when Senator Williams, who had been released from prison after serving 4 years of his sentence, began giving interviews claiming that he had been framed by ambitious prosecutors using unreliable testimony from disgruntled employees. He never mentioned Maggie by name, but his descriptions of cleaning ladies with grudges made his target clear. The criticism stung more than Maggie expected. She had never sought publicity or profit from her experience, and the suggestion that she was somehow dishonest or opportunistic felt like a betrayal of everything she had sacrificed. There were moments when she wondered if she should return to a quiet life and let others carry on the fight for accountability. But those doubts always faded when she received letters from people whose lives had been changed by her example. A young security guard who had exposed fraud at a construction company, a cafeteria worker who had revealed safety violations at a nuclear facility, a hotel housekeeper who had uncovered human trafficking operations. Each of these cases had been inspired by her story, and each had made the world a little bit safer. The 10th anniversary of the Pinnacle case was marked by a ceremony at the Justice Department where Maggie was awarded the Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service. The honor was particularly meaningful because it came from the same government institution that had initially seemed so unreachable when she was just a cleaning lady with dangerous information. In her acceptance speech, Maggie reflected on how much had changed since that night when she first overheard the conversation that would transform her life. 10 years ago, I was invisible, she said. People like the ones I worked for saw me as part of the furniture, useful, but not worth noticing. That invisibility was supposed to be my limitation, but it became my strength. She paused, looking out at an audience that included FBI directors, federal prosecutors, and congressional leaders, people who now valued her insights and sought her advice. The most important thing I've learned is that democracy depends on ordinary people being willing to do extraordinary things. Not because we're heroes, but because we're citizens. And citizenship isn't a passive role, it's an active responsibility. The ceremony was attended by dozens of other whistleblowers who had been inspired by her case, creating a reunion of people who had risked everything to expose corruption and crime. As Maggie looked around the room, she saw faces that reflected the diversity of American men and women of all races and backgrounds, united by their willingness to speak truth to power. After the ceremony, Sarah, now an accomplished investigative journalist in her own right, approached her mother with tears in her eyes. "Dad would be so proud," she said. "He always believed that one person could make a difference. And you've proven him right 100 times over." That evening, as Maggie reflected on the journey that had brought her from a cleaning cart to the podium at the Justice Department, she thought about all the women still working invisible jobs in offices and buildings across the country. They were emptying trash cans, mopping floors, and cleaning windows, while the powerful people around them conducted business, never imagining that the help might be listening, understanding, and perhaps someday finding the courage to act. Her story had proven that in America, the most dangerous person to a corrupt system might not be a federal agent or an investigative reporter. It might be a woman with a mop and bucket who knows right from wrong and isn't afraid to act on that knowledge. Margaret Henderson had started as a simple janitor who found out a secret, but she had become something much more important. A reminder that in a democracy, everyone's voice matters. And sometimes the quietest voices can shout the loudest truths. The impact of her courage would continue to ripple outward for years to come, inspiring others to step out of the shadows and into the light, proving that the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary acts of bravery. And somewhere in America, another cleaning lady was walking down another hallway, unknowingly carrying the power to change the world in her pocket if only she could find the courage to use it. The Margaret Henderson story had become more than just a case study in whistleblowing. It had become a testament to the idea that democracy's greatest strength lies not in its institutions or its leaders, but in the willingness of its ordinary citizens to hold those institutions and leaders accountable, regardless of the personal cost. It was a lesson that would echo through courtrooms and congressional hearings for generations to come, carried forward by the simple but powerful truth that sometimes the most important witness is the one nobody thought was watching. 20 years after that fateful night at Pinnacle Shooting Club, Margaret Henderson stood in her small apartment, preparing for what she knew would be her final public speaking engagement. At 72, she had decided it was time to step back from the spotlight and let the next generation of advocates carry the torch forward. The apartment was modest but comfortable, filled with framed photographs from award ceremonies, newspaper clippings from major cases, and letters from people whose lives had been changed by her example. On her desk sat a worn copy of the First Ordinary Heroes Foundation annual report, documenting 43 successful whistleblower cases in its inaugural year alone. As she adjusted her simple blue suit, the same one she had worn to testify before Congress 5 years earlier, Maggie reflected on how surreal her life had become. Tomorrow, she would speak at Harvard Law School about the importance of protecting working-class voices in the justice system. The girl who had barely graduated high school was now being asked to address some of the brightest legal minds in the country. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same elite institutions that had once seemed so unreachable were now seeking her wisdom, recognizing that true understanding of justice couldn't be found only in law books and case studies. It required the perspective of people who had lived on the margins and found the courage to speak from them. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, now the editor of a major investigative news organization. "Watching your speech online tonight. Mom, you've inspired more people than you'll ever know." Below the message was a photo of Sarah's own daughter, Emma, Aga 8, wearing a t-shirt that read, "Future Truth Teller." Maggie smiled, thinking about the granddaughter who would grow up in a world where the voices of ordinary people carried more weight because of the path she and others had carved. Emma would never have to wonder if her observations mattered, or if anyone would listen to a woman from a working-class background who happened to witness something important. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Outside stood a young woman in her 20s, nervously clutching a manila envelope. "Mrs. Henderson? My name is Jennifer Cheney. Think you knew my father. David, the prosecutor who helped with your case. I'm a paralegal at a law firm downtown, and I've discovered something I think you should see." Maggie recognized the fear and determination in the young woman's eyes, the same combination she had felt all those years ago when she first realized the magnitude of what she had stumbled across. As she invited Jennifer inside, Maggie understood that her story wasn't ending. It was simply passing to the next chapter, carried forward by another ordinary person who had found herself in possession of extraordinary information and was searching for the courage to act on it. The cycle would continue, She realized, as long as there were people willing to step out of the shadows when justice demanded it, her legacy wasn't just the cases she had inspired or the foundation she had built. It was the knowledge that in America, the most powerful force for change often came from the most unexpected places, wielded by the most unlikely heroes who simply refused to stay silent when silence meant complicity.